Imagine that after the death of a loved one, your mother-in-law triumphantly throws a forged will on the table, leaving you with nothing. Your own husband stands aside and silently watches your humiliation. You are all alone. But what if you had a secret? A secret video recording made by the deceased that will not only restore justice, but also threaten the fraudster with prison. Before we begin this story of betrayal and justice from beyond the grave, please write what city you're from in the comments below. And I also wanted to say hi to my subscribers Cynthia from Virginia, Taya from South Africa, and Martha from London. Thanks for staying with me, ladies. My name is Sharon, and I am 48 years old. The silence in our living room was a living entity, a heavy, suffocating blanket thick with the scent of day-old funeral lilies and the unspoken grief that had taken up residence in our home. It had only been a week since we had buried my father-in-law, Charles, but his absence was an amputation, a raw and aching void that none of us knew how to fill. He had been the heart of this house, the quiet, steady rhythm beneath the often chaotic melody of our family. Now the rhythm was gone, and all that was left was a tense, unbearable quiet. We were all gathered, the last sad act in the long, exhausting play of his passing. I sat on the sofa, a half-empty teacup cold in my hands. My husband, Michael, stood by the window, staring out at the manicured lawn of our Charlotte, North Carolina home, his back a rigid wall of unspoken emotion. He was a ghost in his own grief, a man so thoroughly conditioned by his mother's overbearing presence that he had forgotten how to feel his own feelings without her permission. And then there was his mother, Beatrice, my mother-in-law. She sat opposite me in Charles's favorite leather armchair, a queen who had just reclaimed her throne. She was dressed in a severe but impeccably tailored black dress, a costume of mourning that did nothing to mask the cold, triumphant gleam in her eyes. She was not grieving. She was consolidating power. Charles had been more than a father-in-law to me. He was my mentor, my confidant, the only true father figure I had ever known. We had shared a bond forged in the quiet spaces of this family, in late afternoon conversations on the porch while Beatrice was at her bridge club and Michael was at work. He was a man of quiet intelligence and immense integrity, a lover of history and jazz with a gentle, elegant cursive that I could recognize anywhere. In his final years, as his health failed, I had seen the way Beatrice's constant, withering criticism had worn him down, chipping away at his spirit until the proud, strong man I had first met became a frail, weary shadow. Our talks had been his only refuge, a small island of peace in the turbulent sea of his own home. He had spoken often, and with a heavy heart, of his fears for the future, for the grandchildren he adored, and of his determination not to let his wife's bitterness poison their legacy, as it had poisoned his own life. "You're the strong one, Sharon," he'd whispered to me just a few weeks before he passed, his hand frail in mine. "You'll have to be the guardian of our family's future. I'm counting on you." Beatrice cleared her throat, a sharp, theatrical sound that shattered the heavy silence. "Well," she began, her voice crisp and businesslike, devoid of any semblance of sorrow, "I suppose there's no sense in prolonging this. We all know what Charles wanted." She reached into the expensive leather handbag at her side and retrieved a single folded sheet of paper. She let the paper unfold with a dramatic flourish and placed it on the polished surface of the coffee table between us. It landed with a soft, definitive slap. It was a will. "This is all mine now," she declared, her voice a blade that sliced through the quiet room. "The house, the accounts, the stocks. Charles came to his senses at the end. He understood who his real family was, who had been truly loyal to him all these years. I stared at the document, at the angry, jagged scrawl that was supposed to be his signature. It was a grotesque parody of his elegant script, a violent, clumsy forgery that was as blatant as the lie she was telling. My mind reeled. This wasn't just a grab for money, it was a desecration of his memory, an attempt to rewrite his entire life's narrative into one that suited her own selfish ends. I looked at Michael, my husband, my partner. I sent a desperate, silent plea across the room, begging him to speak, to defend his father's honor, to defend me. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the oak tree outside, his silence a resounding, unforgivable act of betrayal. He was her son, first and always. I was just the outsider, the interloper, the woman who had stolen a small piece of his father's heart that she believed belonged only to her. Beatrice's lips curled into a triumphant smirk. She looked directly at me, her eyes gleaming with a victory she had been plotting for years. "And you, my dear," she said, savoring each venomous syllable, "you get nothing." The words were meant to break me, and for a moment they almost did. The injustice of it all, the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of her actions in a house still draped in mourning, was a physical blow. But then, as I looked at her gloating face and at my husband's weak, silent back, my grief and my shock began to crystallize into something else entirely. It was a cold, hard, and utterly lucid resolve. The memory of Charles's frail hand in mine, of his desperate, pleading eyes, of the promise I had made to him came rushing back. "I'm counting on you." He had known this was coming. He had known his wife, and he had known his son. And he had made a plan. My tears receded, and the cold, quiet strength filled the void. I was alone in this fight, but I was not unarmed. I looked at my husband, at his slumped shoulders and the way he stared so intently out the window at nothing, and a profound, desolate loneliness washed over me. I was a lone soldier on a battlefield, abandoned by my closest ally. Beatrice's triumphant smirk seemed to widen, sensing my isolation, savoring my despair. She thought she had won. She thought the story was over. What she didn't understand was that my strongest ally wasn't in this room at all. He had armed me for this very battle before he'd ever left. As I stared at the angry, fraudulent scrawl pretending to be his signature, my mind recoiled from the ugliness of the present and sought refuge in the warmth of the past. The cold, funereal silence of the living room faded away, replaced by the memory of a sun-drenched afternoon in the solarium just 2 weeks ago. Charles was in his favorite armchair, a thick tartan blanket over his frail legs, a book of poetry lying open but unread in his lap. The cancer had taken his strength, but it had not touched the sharp, clear light in his eyes. I was sitting with him, reading an article from the newspaper aloud, our comfortable ritual a small anchor of normalcy in the turbulent sea of his final days. He had suddenly reached out, his hand thin and papery, resting on my arm. "Sharon," he'd said, his voice a dry whisper, but his gaze as intense as ever, "we need to talk, really talk." I put the paper down. I knew this was not a conversation about the weather or politics. This was the conversation we had both been avoiding. "I am not a fool, my dear," he'd begun, his eyes holding mine. "I know my wife. I have loved her for 50 years, but I have never been blind to her nature. She is a woman who sees love as a form of ownership and security as a form of control. Her greatest fear is not losing me. It is losing this." He had gestured weakly to the beautiful sunlit room around us, to the house that was his legacy and her kingdom. "She will not let it go easily." He paused, taking a rattling breath. And my son, our Michael, a look of profound, heartbreaking sorrow had filled his eyes. He is a good man, a kind man, but he is not a strong one. I see your mother's fear in him, Sharon. She has spent his entire life breaking his spirit, teaching him that her approval is the only currency that matters. He loves you. I know he does. But he is terrified of her. When the time comes, he will not be able to stand up to her. He will not be able to protect you or the children from her. His words were not an accusation, but a sad, simple statement of fact, a truth I had lived with for 20 years, but had never been brave enough to admit to myself. You, he'd continued, his grip on my arm tightening slightly. You are the only one in this family she could never break. She has tried with her little barbs, her constant criticisms, but you have a core of steel, Sharon. She has always sensed it, and it terrifies her. That is why she resents you so much, and that is why I need you. It was then that he laid out his fears, his words, a chilling prophecy of the very scene that was now unfolding in my living room. She will have a will of her own, Sharon. After I am gone, she will produce a document, a piece of paper that says whatever she wants it to say. It will be full of lies, and it will be designed to erase you, to punish you for being the one person she couldn't control. Do not be surprised by it. Expect it. I had just stared at him, my heart aching for this dying man who was forced to spend his final days plotting against his own wife to protect his family. The real will, he'd said, his voice dropping lower, is with my lawyer, Mr. Davies. It is simple. The house, the assets, everything is to be placed into a trust. The purpose of the trust is to fund the grandchildren's education and to provide for their future. And you, my dear Sharon, are to be the sole executor and trustee. He saw the shock on my face and held up a hand. It is the only way. Michael does not have the strength to stand against her. She would drain the accounts in a year to fund her lifestyle. You are the only one I trust to be the guardian of their future, to ensure they grow up free of her poison. I need you to promise me you will fight for it. The memory was so vivid, so powerful, it was like a surge of pure strength injected directly into my soul. I could feel the light return to my own eyes. The grief, the shock, the feeling of betrayal, they were all still there, but they were now overshadowed by a powerful, clarifying sense of purpose. I had made a promise to the best man I had ever known, and I would not break it. The flashback ended, and I was back in the cold, tense living room. Beatrice was watching me, her triumphant smile beginning to waver, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty at the change in my demeanor. I was no longer the grieving, defeated victim. I had been given my marching orders from beyond the grave. All right, Beatrice, I said, and the calm in my own voice surprised me. I see your document. I looked at my husband, then back at her. You are right. This is a family matter, and it should be settled by a professional. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, a cold, hard resolve settling over me like a suit of armor. I believe it's time we all took a trip to see Charles's lawyer. Beatrice's triumphant smirk returned, her brief moment of uncertainty washed away by a fresh wave of arrogance. The lawyer? She scoffed, a brittle, dismissive laugh escaping her lips. Fine. Let's all go see dear old Mr. Davies. He's a professional. He will read this document, she tapped the forged will with a perfectly manicured fingernail, and he will confirm every last word. He'll probably charge you for the humiliation, Sharon. Let's go. The sooner we get this over with, the sooner I can have you removed from my house. Her confidence would have been terrifying if I hadn't been a silent party to the last meeting Charles ever had with his lawyer. Her threat of having me removed from her house was so ludicrously ironic it was almost funny. As she stood up to grab her purse, a queen already planning her coronation, my mind once again left the cold, tense living room and traveled back 1 week to the quiet, wood-paneled sanctuary of Mr. Davies's office downtown, the day we had set the trap. Getting Charles there had been a monumental undertaking. The cancer had left him so weak that the simple act of getting dressed felt like climbing a mountain. But on that day, he was possessed by a strength that was not of the body, but of the will. It was the final, most important piece of business of his life, and he would not be deterred. I had helped him into his best suit, the gray one he'd worn for our wedding, and had driven him to the office, his frail hand resting on my arm as we walked slowly, from the car to the elevator. He was a man on a mission. Mr. Davies, a calm, serious professional who had been the family's lawyer and Charles's friend for over 30 years, greeted us with a somber but kind expression. He led us into his library, a room that smelled of old leather and justice, and helped Charles settle into a comfortable armchair. "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice, Jonathan," Charles had said, his voice a frail whisper, but his eyes as sharp and clear as ever. "Of course, Charles." "Anything," the lawyer replied, his gaze full of a deep, sorrowful respect for his dying friend. "We are here today," Charles continued, his gaze shifting between me and the lawyer, "because I have a problem that will outlive me, a problem named Beatrice." He said it without malice, a simple statement of a sad, intractable fact. "You and I both know she will not honor the will you have on file. The moment I am gone, she will produce her own version, a document that benefits only her and punishes those I wish to protect. We need something more, something undeniable." It was Mr. Davies who suggested it. "There is an option, Charles," he'd said, leaning forward. "It's something we've started recommending in cases of potential elder manipulation or contested estates. A video testament. It's a formal recording, witnessed and notarized, where you state your wishes directly. It serves as powerful, almost irrefutable proof of the testator's state of mind and true intentions at the time the will was signed. It's very difficult to argue with a man speaking his own truth from beyond the grave." A look of profound relief had washed over Charles's weary features. "Yes," he'd whispered, "that's it. That is exactly what we need to do." Mr. Davies had a small, high-definition camera on a tripod ready in the corner of his office. He positioned it in front of Charles's chair, the small black lens an unblinking, impartial witness. The atmosphere in the room became solemn, charged with the weight of a final, sacred act. I sat just out of the camera's frame, a silent, supportive presence. I watched as Charles, with a surge of his old, formidable strength, straightened his shoulders and looked directly into the lens. For a moment, the illness, the frailty, it all seemed to fall away, and he was once again the powerful, confident man I had known and loved. "My name is Charles Hardgrove," he began, his voice surprisingly steady and clear. "Today's date is August 14th, 2025. I am here in the office of my attorney, Jonathan Davies, and with my daughter-in-law, Sharon Parker, as my witness. I am of sound mind and body. Well," he'd added, with a flash of his old wry humor, "of sound mind at least, and I am making this recording to supplement my final will and testament, which I am signing today." He took a breath, gathering his strength for the most important part. I am recording this message because I have profound and serious reason to believe that my true wishes for the distribution of my estate will be contested after my death, specifically by my wife, Beatrice Hardgrove. For the sake of the court, for the sake of my grandchildren's future, and for my own final peace of mind, I wish to make my intentions irrevocably and undeniably clear. He had spoken for 10 minutes, his words a powerful, heartbreaking, and meticulously crafted testament. The memory of it, the knowledge of the digital ghost we had created that day, was the secret that now allowed me to face my mother-in-law's blustering confidence with such unnerving calm. After the recording was finished and Charles had signed the true will with a steady hand, he gave his lawyer his final, precise instructions. His mind, the mind of a brilliant strategist, was thinking 2 steps ahead. "Jonathan," he'd said, looking his friend in the eye, "you are to keep this recording in your vault. When the time comes, you are to present my legally signed and witnessed will to my family. If, and only if, my wife, Beatrice, presents an alternative document, a will I did not sign, a forgery, then you are to play this video for all parties present. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Charles," Mr. Davies had replied, his voice thick with admiration for his friend's final brilliant move. That was the protocol, the trap. And as I sat in my living room watching my mother-in-law confidently march towards her own destruction, I felt a pang of pity for her. She was a chess player who thought she had declared checkmate, completely unaware that my king had made one last devastating move before he had even left the board. The memory of Charles's final brilliant act of defiance, of the digital ghost we had created and stored in the lawyer's vault, was the armor I wore as I walked back into the living room. The flashback had taken only a few seconds, but in that time my entire demeanor had shifted. The grieving, cornered victim was gone, and in her place stood the calm, confident executor of my father-in-law's true and final will. Beatrice was already on her feet, grabbing her purse from the side table, energized and eager for the final confrontation that she believed would solidify her victory. "Well, let's go," she announced, a general leading her troops into a battle she was certain she had already won. "Michael, get the car. Sharon, you can ride in the back." The car ride to Mr. Davies's office was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a 20-minute claustrophobic journey into the heart of my mother-in-law's bottomless arrogance. She insisted on driving her own gleaming black Cadillac, another symbol of the wealth she believed was now entirely hers. Michael sat in the passenger seat, a silent, stoic statue staring out the window, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I sat in the back, an observer in a rolling diorama of my own disintegrating marriage, and I listened as Beatrice planned her new life out loud. "The very first thing I'm going to do," she began, her eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror with a look of malicious glee, "is tear out that dreadful rose garden Charles was so fond of. It's a ridiculous amount of upkeep. I'll pave it over and extend the patio. A much better space for entertaining, don't you think?" I said nothing. I just watched the familiar streets of Charlotte slide by, the city a silent, unconcerned witness to my family's quiet implosion. "And the dining room wallpaper," she continued, her voice gaining momentum, "that hideous floral print, it has to go. I'm thinking something in a silk, perhaps a deep crimson. It's time this house reflected my tastes for a change. I've spent 50 years living with Charles's bland, boring choices." She spoke of the man we had just buried as if he were a nuisance, a tiresome roommate whose bad taste she was finally free to correct. Every word was a small, cruel shovel, digging away at his memory, trying to bury him all over again under a mountain of her own selfish desires. Then she turned her attention to me. "Now, about your living situation, Sharon," she said, her voice taking on a tone of magnanimous, condescending charity. "I am not a cruel woman. I will give you 30 days to find a suitable small apartment for you and the children. You'll need to be out by the end of the month, of course. I'll need the space." "Michael, naturally," she said, placing a proprietary hand on her son's shoulder, "will be staying in his childhood home, with his mother, where he belongs." I looked at the back of my husband's head. I waited for him to turn, to argue, to show even a flicker of protest at the casual, unilateral dismantling of our shared life. He did not move. He did not speak. His silence was his answer. It was his consent. In that moment, 20 years of marriage, of shared dreams and private jokes, of raising children and building a life, all of it seemed to evaporate, leaving behind only the cold, hard truth. I was married to a child, and his mother had just called him home. My gaze drifted from his silent form to my own reflection in the car window. I thought of the promise I had made to Charles. I thought of my own children, who deserved a future free from this toxic, suffocating dynamic. A strange, unexpected peace settled over me. Beatrice thought she was outlining my bleak, lonely future, but in reality, she was giving me the one thing I hadn't realized I so desperately needed: permission to leave. She was showing me, with a brutal, undeniable clarity, that there was nothing left here to save. "We're here," Beatrice announced, pulling the car into a reserved spot in front of an imposing, respectable-looking brick building. She turned off the engine and looked at me one last time in the rearview mirror, her eyes glittering with a final, triumphant challenge. "Are you ready for your day in court, dear?" I met her gaze, and for the first time I let a small, genuine smile touch my lips. "More than you could ever know, Beatrice," I said softly. We rode the elevator up to the 3rd floor in a tense, humming silence. Beatrice strode into the law office of Davies and Finch like a conquering queen, her head held high, the forged will clutched in her hand like a scepter. Michael trailed in her wake, his head bowed. I followed a few paces behind, a quiet, unassuming figure they had long since written off. The receptionist showed us into a large, wood-paneled conference room. Mr. Davies was already there, standing by the window, his expression grim and serious. He greeted us with a polite, professional nod. "Beatrice, Michael, Sharon," he said, "please have a seat." We sat around the large, polished mahogany table, the space between us feeling like a vast, empty battlefield. Beatrice, unable to contain her eagerness, slid the forged will across the table to him. "Jonathan," she said, her voice full of a confidence she had no right to possess. "As you can see, Charles's final wishes are quite clear. We are here today to have you formally execute this document." Mr. Davies picked up the paper. He looked at it for a long, silent moment. He looked at the jagged, angry signature at the bottom. Then he placed it carefully on the table in front of him. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a deep and profound pity. "I see, Beatrice," he said, his voice heavy. "But before we discuss this document, there is something else. Charles left some very specific instructions with me. A protocol, if you will." He turned to the large monitor on the wall at the end of the room and picked up a remote control. Beatrice walked into that room believing she was the author of our family's final chapter. She had no idea she was a condemned woman walking into her own sentencing, and that the judge was about to speak to her from beyond the grave. Beatrice stared at the lawyer, her perfectly painted lips thinning into a hard, suspicious line. The effortless confidence she had worn like a fine coat just moments before was beginning to fray at the edges. "Protocol?" she repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. "What on earth are you talking about, Jonathan? There is no protocol. The will is the will." She gestured imperiously at the forged document still sitting on the polished table. "It is perfectly clear, signed and dated. Are you trying to complicate this? Are you trying to drive up your billable hours now that your best client is gone?" Mr. Davies, a man who had weathered the storms of Beatrice's temper for 3 decades, remained completely unruffled. He looked at her not with fear, but with a kind of weary, professional pity. "Beatrice," he said, his voice calm and steady, "Charles was my friend, but he was also my client. And as his attorney, I am bound to follow his final explicit instructions to the letter. He anticipated that there might be some confusion after his passing." The lawyer's choice of the word confusion was a masterpiece of legal understatement, a delicate silk glove covering an iron fist. "He instructed me, in a legally binding directive, that if any testamentary document other than the one he signed and had witnessed in this office was presented to me, I was to play this recording for all parties involved." He picked up the forgery, holding it delicately between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a soiled piece of evidence. "This document, which I do not recognize, qualifies as such an event." Before Beatrice could erupt into the furious protest that was gathering on her lips, Mr. Davies picked up a small black remote and pointed it at the large, dark monitor on the conference room wall. He pressed a button. The screen flickered to life. For a moment, it was just a blank blue background, and then stark white letters appeared. "Final video testament of Charles Hardgrove. Date August 14th, 2025. The sight of the formal title, the undeniable proof of a pre-planned secret act, was the first real blow to Beatrice's composure. The color began to drain from her face as she realized this was not some impromptu legal maneuver, but a carefully laid trap set by her own husband weeks before his death. Then the screen changed, and he was there. My Charles. He was seated in the same comfortable armchair from the lawyer's library where we had sat just a week before his passing. The video was shot in high definition, and it was merciless in its clarity, showing the true, devastating toll the illness had taken on his body. He was shockingly frail, a man reduced to bone and spirit, but his eyes, the kind, intelligent eyes I had fallen in love with 30 years ago, were blazing with a lucidity and a purpose that seemed to defy the weakness of his body. He looked directly into the camera, not as a victim, but as a man who had come to deliver one final unassailable truth. The room was so silent, I could hear the frantic pounding of my own heart. "My name is Charles Hardgrove," he began, his voice a dry, reedy whisper, but every word was infused with an unshakable authority. "I am recording this message today because I have reason to believe that my true and final wishes for the distribution of my life's work will be misrepresented after my death. For the sake of the court and for my own final peace of mind, I wish to make my intentions irrevocably clear." He paused, taking a slow, rattling breath, and then he turned his gaze slightly as if he could see his wife sitting right there in the room with us. "Beatrice," he said, and his voice was not filled with hatred, but with a sorrow so deep it was almost biblical. "For 50 years I tried to be the man you wanted me to be, a provider, a success, a pillar of the community, but nothing I ever achieved was enough to fill the empty, angry space inside of you. You saw my love not as a gift to be cherished, but as a resource to be managed. You saw my spirit not as a partner to yours, but as an obstacle to be broken. You have lived your life in a fortress of bitterness, Beatrice, and you have tried with all your might to make my son and me your prisoners within its walls. He then shifted his gaze again, and I felt a chill run down my spine as his eyes seemed to look directly at my husband. Michael, he said, and the disappointment in his voice was a physical blow. My son, I have always loved you. But love, real love, is not a passive thing. It is an action. It is a choice. And I have watched for 40 years as you have consistently chosen your mother's approval over your own integrity. I watched her chip away at your strength, at your confidence, at your very soul, and you let her. A man who cannot protect his own wife, his own children from the cruelty of others, even from his own mother, has failed in his most fundamental duty as a husband and a father. The words, so full of a father's final, painful honesty, hung in the silent conference room. I chanced to glance at my husband. Michael had his face buried in his hands, his body shaking with the silent, racking sobs of a man who had just been judged by the one person whose opinion he valued most in the world and had been found wanting. The image of my father-in-law remained on the screen, his sad, disappointed eyes seeming to bore directly into the very soul of his son. The only sound in the polished, wood-paneled conference room was the sound of Michael's choked, heartbroken sobs. He was a man utterly undone, his entire life's foundation of denial and appeasement shattered by his father's final posthumous truth. Beatrice, however, was not weeping. The initial shock had been replaced by a simmering, volcanic rage. Her face was a mask of cold fury, her knuckles white where she gripped the arms of her chair. She was a queen whose subjects had just staged a successful rebellion, and she was not prepared to go down without a fight. "This is a farce," she hissed, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "A performance. He was a sick, dying man, and she shot a look of pure venom at me. She obviously manipulated him, poisoned his mind against his own family. Mr. Davies did not even look at her. His gaze was still fixed on the screen where the image of his old friend now took a slow, deliberate breath. As if on cue, the Charles on the video shifted his tone. The sad, heartbroken father receded, and in his place emerged the sharp, meticulous, and utterly commanding man he had been in his prime. "Now," his voice continued from the speakers, clear and businesslike, "let us discuss the matter of the estate itself." Beatrice's head snapped back towards the screen, her fury momentarily silenced by the shift in his tone. "My last will and testament, which I have signed today and which my attorney, Mr. Davies, holds in his possession, is the sole and final authority on the distribution of my assets," Charles stated. "Any other document presented is fraudulent and should be treated as such." He looked directly into the camera, and I felt a chill as he delivered the first devastating blow. My entire estate, the house on Selwyn Avenue, my stock portfolio, my pension, and all liquid assets, is to be placed into a newly created irrevocable trust. The trust will be known as the Charles and Sharon Hardgrove Education Trust for Future Generations. He had put my name in the title. It was a final public declaration of our alliance, a posthumous slap in the face to his wife and son. I saw Beatrice flinch as if she had been physically struck. "The sole purpose of this trust," Charles continued, his voice leaving no room for argument, "is to provide for the health, education, and well-being of my grandchildren, both born and yet to be born. The trust's assets are to be used for their college tuitions, for down payments on their first homes, and for the seed capital of any businesses they may wish to start. It is a legacy of opportunity, not of idle luxury. He then delivered the next blow, the one that stripped Beatrice of all her power. The sole, unchallengeable executor and trustee of this fund will be my daughter-in-law, Sharon Parker. I have had the privilege of observing her integrity, her quiet strength, and her financial acumen for 20 years. I trust her with my legacy, and more importantly, with my grandchildren's future, absolutely and without reservation. The room was utterly silent. Beatrice was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a supplicant, a dependent on the goodwill of the very woman she had just tried to disinherit. As for my wife, Beatrice, Charles said, his voice softening slightly but with a tone of clinical finality, the trust will provide a modest monthly stipend sufficient for her living expenses, contingent upon her remaining in the family home. The house itself will now be owned and managed by the trust. The same provision is made for my son, Michael. This is not a punishment, he added, but a protection. It is to protect the estate that I spent my life building from Beatrice's avarice and from Michael's lifelong inability to stand against her. Beatrice made a small, strangled sound in the back of her throat. She had been rendered a tenant in her own kingdom, a queen reduced to a pensioner. But Charles was not finished. He had saved his final, most devastating move for last. He leaned slightly closer to the camera, his eyes seeming to narrow, his voice dropping to a low, confidential, and utterly menacing tone. "And now, Beatrice," he said, "we must discuss one final private matter." The air in the room grew thick, heavy. Even I did not know what was coming next. "I am, as you know, a meticulous man," Charles said. "My records are perfect, which is why I'm aware that for the past 7 years you have been systematically diverting funds from our joint investment accounts into a private offshore account under your maiden name. As of my last accounting, the total amount you have embezzled is just over $374,000. Beatrice let out a small involuntary gasp. It was the sound of a secret, shameful life being dragged out into the light. "The evidence of this embezzlement," Charles continued, his voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel. "Every transfer, every date, every account number is in a sealed file that is currently in Mr. Davies's possession. If you or Michael choose to contest this will, if you dare to challenge Sharon's authority as trustee, if you make any trouble for her whatsoever, Mr. Davies has my final notarized instruction to turn that entire file over to the district attorney. So, the choice is yours, Beatrice. A quiet, comfortable life on a modest income, or a very public trial for grand larceny and the very real possibility of spending your final years in prison." He leaned back in his chair, his work done. A final, heartbreakingly sad smile touched his lips. He looked into the camera one last time. "To my grandchildren, know that your grandfather loved you more than words can say. Sharon, thank you. Goodbye." The screen went black. But the image of my father-in-law's face, his eyes filled with a sad, resolute finality, remained burned onto the back of my eyelids. The silence that descended upon the conference room was absolute. A heavy, airless void where a family's dirty secrets had just been brutally and methodically excavated. It was the silence of a bomb crater, the quiet that follows total annihilation. The triumphant, angry energy that Beatrice had brought into the room was gone, replaced by the limp, heavy presence of her utter and complete devastation. She was slumped in her high-backed leather chair, her hands lying limply in her lap, a queen whose kingdom, crown, and very identity had been stripped from her in the space of 10 minutes. She was no longer a formidable matriarch. She was just a broken old woman, exposed and trapped by the ghost of the husband she had so grievously underestimated. My husband, Michael, had finally lifted his head from his hands. His face was a wreck of tear-streaked shame and disbelief. He looked at his mother, then at me, his eyes wide with a dawning horror, as if seeing the true toxic landscape of his life for the very first time. Mr. Davies, the calm, professional center of our emotional storm, was the one to finally break the silence. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to a locked filing cabinet, retrieved a thick, sealed manila envelope, and placed it on the table next to the fraudulent will, which now looked like a pathetic, childish scribble. "This," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "is the file Mr. Hardgrove mentioned. It contains all the relevant financial documentation. And this," he added, tapping a formally bound document, "is his original signed and witnessed last will and testament, which I will now file with the probate court." He then looked directly at Beatrice, his gaze not unkind but utterly uncompromising. "Your instructions, Beatrice, were quite clear, as was the choice Charles left you. The choice is now yours to make." The meeting was over. There was nothing left to say, no arguments to be made, no deals to be struck. Justice in its final, immutable form had been delivered from the grave. The process of leaving the office was a slow, agonizing walk of shame. Michael, his face still pale and blotchy from crying, had to rise and gently touch his mother's arm to rouse her from her catatonic state. She seemed to have aged 20 years in the past half hour. Her formidable, iron-willed posture had dissolved, leaving behind a frail, stooped old woman who had to be helped from her chair. She walked with a slow, shuffling gait, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the receptionists in the lobby who, just an hour before, had greeted her with the deference due to the wife of their firm's most esteemed client. I walked a few paces behind them, a deliberate, symbolic distance. I was no longer a part of their toxic two-person ecosystem. I was a separate entity, an observer. As we waited in the hushed, marble-floored lobby for the elevator, I felt not a shred of the triumph I might have expected. Instead, a profound and weary sadness washed over me. I had won. I had fulfilled my promise to Charles. I had secured my children's future, but the cost had been the complete and utter demolition of the family I had been a part of for 2 decades. It was a necessary demolition, a clearing of a rotten and condemned structure, but it was a demolition nonetheless. It was there, in the quiet, anonymous space of the lobby, that Michael finally turned to me. His mother had sunk onto a plush leather bench, a vacant, shattered shell. He approached me hesitantly, his hands twisting together, a nervous, boyish gesture that suddenly filled me with an immense, overpowering sense of pity. "Sharon," he began, his voice a choked, pathetic whisper, I am so sorry. I swear to you I didn't know about the money she was taking, about any of that. I swear." I just looked at him, my expression calm, my heart a cold, quiet stone in my chest. "I was just," he continued, his voice cracking, his excuses a familiar, well-worn litany I had heard in 1,000 smaller battles over the years. "I've always been so afraid of her. You don't know what she's like, what she's capable of, the things she says, the way she can turn on you. My whole life, it's just been easier to stay quiet, to let her have her way. I know it's wrong, but I was scared." I listened to him, to this man I had loved, the father of my children. and I saw him with a sudden brutal clarity through his own father's eyes. A good man, but not a strong one, and I realized in that moment that the distinction between the two was everything. His fear was real, I had no doubt of that. But it was not a justification. It was a diagnosis of a fatal flaw, a cancer of the character that had allowed his mother's toxicity to metastasize and poison our entire family. "It's not about fear, Michael," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "We've all been afraid of her. Your father was afraid of her. I have been afraid of her. The children are afraid of her. The difference is what you do with that fear." I took a step closer, forcing him to meet my gaze. It's about character. It's about choosing what is right over what is easy, especially when it's hard. It's about having a backbone. And you have never, not once in our 20 years together, chosen to stand up for me, for your children, or even for your own father against her. You have always chosen the path of least resistance, the path of a coward. My words, each one a small hard stone of truth, landed in the silent space between us. I watched the final flicker of hope die in my husband's eyes, replaced by the dull gray acceptance of a man finally forced to see his own reflection. His excuses, his pleas of fear, were the last gasps of a narrative he had used his entire life to justify his own weakness. And now, in the harsh, uncompromising light of his father's final testament and my own newfound clarity, that narrative had crumbled to dust. He stood before me, a 50-year-old man, finally, irrevocably, out of excuses. "Sharon, please," he whispered, his voice a pathetic rasp. He took a half step towards me, his hand slightly outstretched. "Don't do this. I can change, I promise. We can go to counseling. I can be stronger for you, for the kids." I looked at him, at this man I had shared a bed with for 2 decades, the father of my children, a man I had once loved with all my heart, and I felt a profound, aching wave of pity. He was not a monster like his mother. He was simply nothing, a vacuum, a space that had been hollowed out by a lifetime of his mother's psychological dominion, leaving no room for a character of his own to grow. He was promising to change now because the entire structure of his life had been demolished, and he was terrified of being left alone in the rubble. His promise wasn't born from a change of heart. It was born from a desperate fear of consequences. And I knew, with a certainty so deep it was a part of my very bones, that the moment the fear subsided, the moment his mother reasserted her influence, he would revert to the man he had always been. "I'm not saying these things to hurt you, Michael," I said, and my voice was surprisingly gentle, the voice of a doctor delivering a sad but necessary diagnosis. "I'm saying them because, for the first time, they need to be said, and because I can no longer live a life where they go unsaid." With a slow, deliberate motion, I began to work my wedding ring off my finger. It had been tight for years, a comfortable, familiar weight. Now, as it slid over my knuckle, it felt like I was shedding a skin, an identity that no longer fit. It was a simple gold band, a symbol of a promise that had been broken not by one single act of betrayal, but by 1,000 tiny surrenders over 20 years. I took his hand, his skin clammy and cold, and I gently placed the ring into his palm, closing his fingers around it. "I am filing for divorce," I said, my voice as clear and steady as my resolve. "I will fulfill your father's will as I promised him I would. I will be the guardian of our children's future. I will use the trust to sell this house, the house of your family's shadows, and I will build a new life for myself and for them. A life of honesty, a life of strength, a life where they will be taught to stand up for what is right, not to cower in the face of what is wrong. I looked at him one last time, at the tears now streaming down his face. "I do wish you well, Michael," I said, and I meant it. "I hope, for your own sake, you find the strength your father always wished for you. But your path is no longer my path, and my children will no longer be walking in your shadow." I let go of his hand. I turned, and without looking back at him, or at the broken woman who was his mother, I walked away. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the law office and stepped out into the bright, brilliant chaos of the Charlotte afternoon. The sun was warm on my face, and the sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of traffic, the chatter of people on the street, rushed in to fill the silence that my old life had left behind. It felt like walking out of a tomb and into the living, breathing world. Every breath I took felt new, clean, and entirely my own. A year later, the house on Selwyn Avenue was sold. The shadows were gone. I had bought a smaller, brighter home in a different neighborhood, a house filled not with the ghosts of a toxic past, but with the loud, joyful chaos of my own children. That evening, I was sitting with my daughter at our new kitchen table, helping her with her college applications, the website for the Charles and Sharon Hardgrove Education Trust, open on my laptop beside us. We were laughing about something, and the sound of our shared joy was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. I no longer thought of Beatrice or Michael with anger. I barely thought of them at all. They were figures from a different life, a different story, one in which I had been a supporting character. In this new story, my story, I was the author. My life was defined not by the family I had married into, but by the one I was building, a legacy of strength and integrity for my children. I had fulfilled my promise to Charles. I had protected his grandchildren, and in doing so, I had finally, blessedly, saved myself.